Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People Strategy Forum. Today, we have a very special guest, and a very important topic. And so, the topic is conflict. And conflict is often a thing that leaders avoid at all costs. But what if I told you that it can be your greatest ally? So today's guest is Dr. Larry Schooler, who has spent his career transforming tense moments into bridges that cross boardrooms, city halls, and communities. As a journalist, mediator, professor, and global consultant, Larry has worked with the EPA, the Department of Defense, and municipalities to turn conflict into collaboration. He has built a bridges across communities and so forth so people can have those important dialogues. And so on this episode, Larry is going to guide us through how healthy conflict can deepen trust, unlock creativity, and energize the workplace culture. So if you want to lead more inclusively, manage real world friction, and build a team that thrives under pressure, this conversation is for you. So welcome, Larry Schooler.
Thank you, Sam. It's really an honor to be joining you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, yes, for sure. And so, first of all, Larry, I know that you have a deep history and you were an award-winning journalist. We've helped communities across the globe. So, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you became the person that you are today, and your real that purpose-driven nature that you have in helping communities?
Yeah, I can, Sam, but it's interesting that you mentioned journalism because when I think about where the seeds of my interest in journalism were planted, it was at a sleepaway camp called Echo Hill Ranch. And Echo Hill is no more than 20 miles from the city of Kerrville. And so, for that reason and others, as I sit here with you today, it's very hard for my mind to be removed from the devastation in Central Texas from the flash flooding. A girl at my kid's school unfortunately died at Camp Mystic. So I just wanted to say that to be present to some of those feelings and thoughts, which I wish I could push further into the background.
Right.
But I feel like my life has taken a fascinating and unexpected trajectory. I did start out my career as a journalist, which was a love again that was planted when I was a bunk reporter at camp, but also a school newspaper person, and worked for NPR for several years. And I think at some point, what I realized was I wanted to be a little bit more involved in fixing the things that I was reporting on, or addressing the things that I was reporting on. I certainly continue to be a huge supporter of quality journalism, and sometimes flirt with going back into it. But I think there just came a point where I felt like I was on the sideline and wanted to be a little bit more in the field of play, so to speak. And so I started working for an elected official, and what I found was that he often would want me to do sort of a version of shuttle diplomacy, where he'd have sort of the seed of a policy idea, but he wanted to make sure that it would pass muster, that would get broad support, not just from his colleagues, but from the community. And so he would send me to visit with, competing perspectives and different stakeholders to try to bang out a compromise or a consensus. And I just found myself enthralled by that, because I never really saw myself as a partisan or someone who wanted to pursue any specific agenda exactly, but more to just do good, do public service, and do good. And I think maybe the neutrality and objectivity I strived for as a journalist started to pay off. And so, really, for the last 17, 18 years, that's been my work, is kind of being an independent third party who can help those affected by decisions affect those decisions in ways that are going to benefit them, but also work for those on the other side of any given issue.
Yes. Very important perspective. Now, one thing I do want to bring back up. I mean, Larry, you mentioned that the catastrophe that happened in Central Texas, where we had that flooding and many young lives were lost and so forth, and this situation. Now, as leaders, there's times where there's a hard message that needs to be delivered, and fear ensues leadership because they know that they can easily mess up. People are already saddened, they're angry, they want to point a finger somewhere, find some sort of truth. In a situation like that, what is the best way for leadership to handle that careful communication?
It wouldn't hurt for them to say some of the very things you just said, Sam, which is that the acknowledgement of what people are feeling makes them feel seen and makes them feel heard. And that's something I tell my students every semester at UT Austin, that people in conflict, more than anything else, need to feel heard, need to feel seen. So even if that elected official or appointed official isn't giving them precise answers for who's responsible or what needs to happen, just telling them that they have a right to be sad, that they have a right to be angry, that they, the leader, bear some responsibility. It doesn't have to be legal liability. It's just responsibility. I'm a leader in this community, or I'm a leader in this state or country, and the buck stops with me. I think that goes a long way, and I know they probably get other kinds of advice to sort of limit what they take responsibility for any number of reasons. I just, again, want leaders to put themselves in the hearts and minds of the people who will hear their words, and just be present to those feelings. And of course, people will eventually want something more substantive, but leading with empathy is never a bad idea.
Yeah, for sure. And then you mentioned specifically accountability in there as well. I think that that's a particular trigger for some leaders that say, well, it's like they something unforeseen happened, obviously, and they and taking accountability in a situation like that can be quite difficult, but also very brave, right?
It can be. And, I think when leaders understand that they can bear some responsibility without bearing all of the responsibility, that goes a long way. I mean, it's not a binary thing, and it sometimes feels as if the leaders who we hear the most from are looking at it as either it's all my fault or it isn't my fault at all, and it's clearly not either or. There are
Mm.
times where the responsibility of a particular leader could be relatively small, and at the same time, if they're the face of an organization, they do have to at least get in front of responsibility that may be held by others in their organization. But if it's their organization to lead, then they need to step forward into that breach. That's part of, I
Mm.
think, what they've signed up to do. So it's a very tricky balance, and I don't pretend to have any sort of algorithm or formula for how to come down on any given scenario. I just know that a lot of conflict happens through miscommunication and the perception of someone not having someone else's best interests at heart. And a lot of that, I think, can be cut off by that initial statement of I know you're hurting, I know you're angry, I'm angry too, or I understand why you are, and I'm going to do what I can to address that as we go forward.
And so there may be many other facets involved in the communication element of something like this. I mean, for instance, if you're when we're thinking about you're the spokesperson for a particular organization, and then also you have your own personal thoughts around the situation. And so, how should leaders balance both that organization and personal, and when should they avoid one or the other?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I, again, don't know that it aligns with any sort of rule of thumb, but I would say that you know part of what tends to happen is we act very reflexively in these moments, and so either folks get metaphorically thrown under a bus, from the standpoint of blame, or they are protected at all costs. And so again, I think it comes back to shades of gray, to being able to say there were a lot of agencies, for example, responsible for keeping folks safe, or that are responsible for keeping folks safe, and each of us have to scrutinize closely where we each fell short and try to do better. So, I think it's extremely important to avoid calling folks out by name individually. I think that goes without saying. But even when it comes to an agency or a division or something, I think we need to manage and probably prevent any sort of systemic indictment from a podium. I think we need to allow cooler heads to prevail and a closer review of variables to occur before anything like that takes place. People will often forget exactly what you say, but they will remember how you made them feel. I can't remember exactly who said that. It's an old quotation, but I think it very much applies in circumstances like this.
One thing that I think is important here that Janice points out and on our audience in LinkedIn is that how important empathy is for leadership. Do you see that as a common trait in many leaders today that you work with?
I do. I mean, I think it's something that you can't live without in the nonprofit sector. If you don't have that skill, you're not. I don't even know if you get hired, much less have any sort of lengthy tenure or profound impact. And so, certainly, when I think about the nonprofit executives that I've encountered, that's an enormously important asset to them, especially in keeping their employees satisfied and coming back and ensuring that their clients get what they need both substantively and emotionally. Because sometimes when, especially in the circumstance we're in now, I may have immediate needs, food, clothing, shelter, but I need to know someone cares about me and is there to help me. And so, having that empathy is mission critical. Um, I think that in corporate circumstances, it can exist. I don't know that there's a particular sector or particular company or industry where I can say, oh, it happens more frequently. But I think there are certainly going to be leaders whose work involves the public more than others, where I think it's especially important because people attach themselves to a particular brand. And so when that's the case, I think the leader has to take some responsibility for how they feel about the brand. I think brands are often connected to the way they make people feel. And then I think you get to our elected leaders and leaders in government. And, that's where I think you really have to consider empathy, because you could be endangering lives. I mean, you're partially there as government to keep people safe. At least that's, I think, the way we've come to think of it in the United States. And so,
Hmm.
you've got to understand, I think, what people may be thinking and feeling as it relates to any number of different ways in which they think their safety could be imperiled.
Right. Well, our big topic of today is how to manage conflict between groups. And I know that you have mediated conflict between significant parties in the past. Has there been, in particular, event or a conflict that comes to mind that really taught you something about the appropriate approach, the right approach, the successful approach?
Well, it may be cliche to answer it this way, Sam, but I mean, I always think about sort of my first major endeavor as a mediator and facilitator, and candidly, it was before I had any real training. And I say that not to sound boastful, like "Wow, look what I did without training," but more, I didn't know what I was doing, and I learned a lot along the way. This was back probably 17 years ago now. I was part of the municipal government here, and we were trying to deal with longstanding tensions over, of all things, events that close streets. So anything from a 5K or a marathon to a festival to a demonstration. And a lot of those events are extremely popular here in town, and they accrue a lot of benefits to nonprofit beneficiaries and, of course, to the people who put them on. And then obviously you have plenty of ancillary impacts to churches, to residents, to surrounding businesses that are much less positive. And so it took us at least 6 months working with a task force of about 15 folks that represented a cross section of interests to kind of hammer out a set of, policy changes and procedural changes and things that everybody seemed to be willing to support, from the marathon organizers all the way to the pastors. And I think what it taught me, among other things, is just because something to me might seem a little bit banal or non-controversial or not a super big deal, doesn't mean it will seem that way to the people involved.
Mhm.
And going back to empathy, I've got to put myself in their shoes. And if I'm a pastor who is dependent on the collection plate and people aren't going to church because they've grown tired of all the detours of getting to church, then my job is imperiled and my ability to support my family is imperiled, for example. Or if a major nonprofit organization has come to rely on a race happening and having a certain amount of revenue come from it, and that's taken away from them, people can lose out on major services from that nonprofit. So, it really taught me a lesson in that. And then I think it also taught me a lesson in patience, which I can't say I had in droves when I was that age. And I still probably could benefit from having more of it. But, the most deeply entrenched conflicts or the most complex ones will take a lot of time to resolve if you're intending to resolve them in a way that is durable. Sometimes, especially as parents, we're quick to say, when two kids are fighting, okay, it's you're right and you're wrong, and that's the end of it. It's never the end of it. Sam, I'm sure as a parent, I mean, that's never a firm resolution. And so, I'm really striving in my work to be inclusive of all of the interests at play, so that whatever is agreed to is something that everybody can see themselves in one form or another. So that was a really big takeaway for me from that formative experience all those years ago that I've carried forward today.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did that. I mean, I know that Austin is no stranger to big events. I mean, I've been there for the past 10 years, enjoying the Cap 10 race that they have there, and I know that they have wonderful events like Austin City Limits that all need to be considered. So it's good to
Yeah,
ensure
my
that
son
place.
ran the Cap 10K for the first time this year, and I've run
Oh,
it.
nice.
And yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where when you're doing it, you don't really give much thought, or at least I didn't, to what else is kind of happening or what's being held up by it. And then when you get into municipal government and you hear from these other stakeholders, you realize, wow, as I said, I'm jeopardizing things that I didn't know about. How do I manage that? So I think we've made some progress.
For sure. So a lot of leaders out there are thinking, okay, well, there's conflict in my organization. There's some of it is quite natural and common for what we see in political divides, and sometimes there's difference in what we think about policy or how we should move forward. So when we think about conflict, is it a good thing to have in an organization?
I mean, I would say in short, yes, because I think that in almost every instance, conflict has within it the seed of growth, of
Mm.
evolution for the organization, of awareness of some part of the organization that needs repair or adjustment, maybe of an aggrieved part of the organization that feels underappreciated or not sufficiently taken care of. So I mean, if anything, it's a warning light. It's a signal that something may need to change.
Mm.
But I also think that it can lead to sort of very personal growth in ways that sometimes are hard to see in the moment, but become apparent later on. When spouses are in conflict, when parents and children, siblings are in conflict, in those moments, each side is normally, sticking to their guns and really holding firm. And if the conflict gets resolved, they can often, in the moment, come to the realization that they were doing something, whether on purpose or inadvertently, that was really
Mhm.
causing harm and that they should stop doing. And in the case of grudges, which we unfortunately see too often, over time, a person can see the error of their ways. They may not want to again admit full culpability for the grudge or anything like that, but they at least will recognize that they've, consciously or subconsciously done something that really hurts someone else. And so, the action they take as a result of that can vary. It doesn't always have to be an apology or a reconciliation, but I really think that if an organization isn't having some form of conflict, they should probably, scrutinize it. As a matter of fact, at UT Austin, an agency called me in not because they were entrenched in conflict, but because they really wanted to be ready for when they would be. In other words, they knew that even if they hadn't faced anything significant in the way of internal strife, that invariably something would come up, whether it's tough choices on funding or promotions or whatever the case may be. And so we kind of teamed up to position them proactively to be prepared for something like that and to not have it, cripple them going forward. And that obviously I think is a real standout way to think about what conflict can do for you.
Mhm. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's definitely conflict can be a growth mechanism in an organization. It can help bring awareness to particular issues, and then leaders, frankly, if they don't have conflict, it should be something that they should be paying attention to,
Yeah, and
because
I think, excuse me, Sam, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I think that there's a difference between, pitting two people against each other
yeah,
or, ginning up conflict through gossip or something
right.
and inviting, competing perspectives or
Hmm.
asking, like, what would someone say who's not in the room, or what would the opposite perspective be? And I think the best example of this is former President Abraham Lincoln, who students of history will remember didn't just, do what he did in the way of the Civil War, but deliberately put a cabinet together that included some of his rivals. And that's been written about, ad nauseum. But I think it's important to remember, and it's extremely uncommon in the modern day. But when you can bring those people into the tent and have a meaningful civil conversation with them, you get better outcomes
Hmm.
that'll satisfy more parts of your organization. Now, it may make for more of a slog in the moment, but it really can be beneficial. There's one other thing you said I just wanted to catch, which is the idea of growth. And I think, the growth mindset here can be conflict is, the same way we need to be audited from time to time or have a budget or make payroll or, just manage our organization, keep the lights on metaphorically. Uh, we're going to have conflict, and having that mindset, not of it being this disease so much as it being a standard part of our operations, I think is really important because it then brings down the emotional temperature a little bit. It makes it less of a crisis and more of an opportunity, or just a mile marker in our organization's journey.
So let's dig into that a little bit. You mentioned kind of like that emotional temperature. I mean, there seems to be phases to conflict, right? So that I mean, just from my own personal experience and hearing you talk, I mean, there's times where there's you can see emotions are high, and so, when should we, bring people together for that conflict mediation? When should we kind of hold off and let temperature cool?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think one of the things that pervades this country, but I almost wonder if it's a global phenomenon, is the lazy tendency we have to label someone as emotional. Don't be so emotional. And I think, frankly, women come in for that a lot more than men, in my experience. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just a flawed, deeply flawed assertion. I mean, frankly, everybody in the world is emotional, and emotions don't necessarily need to be viewed as the enemy of rational thought. They need to be viewed as important signals of something being very important. So I'm not saying that unrestrained anger or long running bawling or something is going to be productive, but it is a signal to both the person having the emotional expression and the recipient that this matters and that it needs to be attended to. But to your point, I mean, there's plenty of research, particularly in psychology, I think, that and brain science that would say that when we are flooded, as it were, and I probably should use a different word today, but when we are consumed by the emotions that we're feeling, when it just feels like that's all we can think about is our sadness or our anger, we're probably in less of a place to brainstorm solutions that will satisfy the other party and us. Right now, in that moment, we need soothing. Even it may be self-soothing, but we need to be soothed or comforted or just have our emotions matter to someone else or to that other party. And so I certainly believe that some things can't be resolved right there in the moment, and have told folks to not necessarily take 10 or sleep on it, but just acknowledge where you are emotionally and decide for yourself whether you think you have the mindset to think more expansively than just on what you are feeling at that moment, because sometimes that's your whole field of vision.
Mhm. So let's take a scenario, that many leaders face out there. So they, through the grapevine or what they hear in the organization, they find that there's two individuals on their team they're having significant conflict, and then it's been going on for quite some time, and they've not been able to resolve it through their own means. So how should this leader solve that situation to preserve the team and its integrity?
Well, one thing that may feel redundant in the way you characterize the scenario, but I don't think is to kind of have a fresh conversation with each of them individually about the conflict itself. I'm sure that the manager probably has occasion to have one-on-ones, and that's the critical thing in any organization. But when it comes to this particular conflict, I think there needs to be a set aside conversation just about it, and questions around, what would success look like for you if we got this resolved? What would change? What would need to happen for you to feel that this had been put to bed? What do you need from the other side? What can you do? There are a lot of questions that manager can ask that person individually, and I think even in mediation, we often find pretty extensive use of something called caucusing or the caucus, where if a mediator is working with two parties, one of them leaves the room and the mediator talks with just one of them. And sometimes a whole mediation can occur with the mediator literally shuttling just between each party individually. You might say that's kind of a weird thing. Well, what I may share in front of the party that I'm in conflict with will differ maybe from someone that I feel I can trust, and I'm not in conflict with. So sometimes you don't necessarily have to have this sort of grand, let's everybody sit down and hash it out kind of scenario. Sometimes it's just a matter of conflict coaching, it's often called. But I think that it's important in those one-on-ones to then ask, how productive do you think it would be if we sat down together? And if so, what are some of the things you would need to have in place in order to feel safe in that space? What are kind of the discussion agreements you'd want to have? And so if you can get some buy-in in that way, then I do think you sit down. Even if you've resolved the substantive issues, I would err on the side of getting the two parties together for just reconnecting, just to kind of see each other again as people and not, colleagues at war, so to speak. But I think that the supervisor does need to roll up her or his sleeves, and it never hurts to involve someone who's entrusted in another part of the organization, like a human resources professional. Some folks have organizational development professionals or ombuds. So it's not to say it needs to be the supervisor's task alone, but it definitely needs to be something that they approach hands-on and not view as just, they'll figure it out eventually if it's prolonged.
And so there, I imagine there, and when we're thinking about their conflict, there's a lot of different varieties, of course, and then acceptable outcomes. And so, as a leader in a business, they may see, they probably had a highly effective team at once, and then there is some sort of conflict that happened among their teammates. And of course, the thing that a leader would love to have happen is to have it to be resolved and everything goes back to normal. But what are some of the most realistic outcomes that you typically see in situations like this? Is it different?
Well, I think certainly there could be circumstances in which someone needs to change teams or be reassigned to a different part of the organization to either avoid interactions with that person. If there's just a seemingly intractable uh, personality based kind of conflict, I always want people to focus more on issues than personalities, because a lot about our personalities doesn't change very easily, and it's a lot harder to absorb someone telling me that I myself am a problem, not my approach to something. So I think if it becomes that personal, certainly a manager or supervisor needs to think about potentially separating those two folks the same way we would do in the classroom, or with our kids. Let's
Hmm.
separate, let's cool down. But I also think that there can be a way to restructure a project that they're on, or redefine their roles within a given project, or even within a given division, to say, you've had some real issues with how Jim is handling this, Jenny. Why don't I actually have you manage this part of it? Because it seems like you have some good and strong ideas about that, and maybe I shift Jim into this other role that might suit him better, or that he would accept, for the sake of being able to move forward. And that's another thing I would say, Sam, is that it's really important not to let the perfect be the enemy to the good here. Not to wait until you have that metaphorical kumbaya where everybody's holding hands and singing. There's going to be some conflict that gets resolved that way, and is remarkable. And then there's most conflict, which will at the time probably feel good and not great, but the lasting impacts of it will in fact be great. So those supervisors and managers need to, again, it's just, I've heard said, take the win. Like have the opportunity to see how something will work if it's actually going to restart folks' engines, and get them back to being productive teammates.
So, as one thing that Janice online has pointed out is that, conflict there's a lot of training in conflict nowadays that managers should have, that, and of course HR is quite equipped with usually. So, when should a manager, and when they see a certain conflict arise, reach out to a professional such as yourself or perhaps HR to get them involved?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I have worked, uh, not as an HR professional myself, but certainly with HR folks, and I'm very uh, in awe, really, of all of the things we expect of human resources, and that we kind of overlook. Not they're not just for onboarding. Obviously, they're for tons of different things. I think we've even you know belabored them more than is reasonable. I guess it sort of depends on the scope in my mind a little bit, meaning that if a conflict has stretched beyond just being between two people, and feels like something that keeps coming up, or is affecting more than just the two folks, but really causing problems with projects on an ongoing basis, that's a situation where I think an outside professional can be useful, because that outside professional has no stake in a particular outcome for that company. I mean, obviously they don't want the company to go under, but they're not there to pick sides. They're not there to play favorites. They just want the company to see its way through. And so an outsider can be useful, especially because the outsider can often get away with certain questions that the manager might not get the same responses to. I think we have to acknowledge that even our very best bosses that we've ever had, there's a power dynamic there, and there may be certain things that we just don't want to say in front of them or to them. And so having that third party can be very powerful. I remember doing some work for a state agency where I distributed a questionnaire in advance and collected responses and anonymized them. And there were people sitting around the table who were shocked by some of what their colleagues had said about the issues. And, that's in some ways surprising, because they worked closely together. But in other ways, I think a recognition that sometimes that outsider can get some information that an insider can't. I also think, though, that we have to be mindful of our own biases. And so, even when a manager thinks that she or he could resolve a particular conflict, or could be neutral, if there's any potential for that to be perceived otherwise. If I'm the manager of two people, one of whom I was buddies with in college, or I'm the manager and one of the people is one of my wife's closest friends, or something like that. It
Hmm.
doesn't really matter that I feel confident in my skills to be objective as much as it may look to the outside. And so having a skilled HR professional is handy in those cases because they just, I think, have less, I think there's less of a perception that they are going to take a particular side or have any kind of conflict of interest. So I also think that external and internal professionals like that can team. I don't know that it always has to be either we farm this out or we keep it in house with HR. I can think of circumstances where it could be both, where an external professional is helping to put out a fire, but the HR folks are helping think through what are our new policies or procedures that we need across the board to kind of prevent this from happening in ways that an outsider wouldn't understand. So I think it could be a good team effort as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And
Sure.
so let's look at another situation here. So we just spoke about the situation where there may be a conflict, an interpersonal conflict within a team. But let's take another leadership scenario, such as when leadership has decided, or they must take an action that, for instance, like a reduction in force for a particular organization, and the employees feel like, oh, it's us against them. There's that type of dynamic. So how should a leader patch that scenario?
It's funny, for whatever reason, when you were when you were talking about that, something came to mind, a distant memory when I was a teenager. And of course, we didn't have all of the technology that we had today. So we had phone trees. So I was like the vice president of notifications. And I remember, I would get the information from the chapter president. And, there were 6 people I called, and then they called 6 people. And the reason I'm thinking about that is I think that a lot of leaders are neglectful, as I think we are in a lot of settings, right? I mean, we don't go to physicals, we go to the emergency room, for example. I think a lot of leaders are less inclined to have those kinds of proactive, regular touch points with parts of their workforce until it's critical that they communicate with their workforce.
Hmm.
And so, of course, I'm not advocating for a phone tree per se, although that would be kind of fun. But I think, I'm thinking in particular, there's a dispute that's broken out here locally that involves one of the unions and management, and it's made the front page. And I don't know all the particulars. I'm not on the inside of that, but sometimes there is a perception that any conversation between management and union leadership, as an example, will be adversarial, will be counterproductive. And who am I to say that it won't be? I mean, I think there are some people who view those kinds of relationships in that way, and they can't break out of that mindset. But I also have seen circumstances where the union leadership get an understanding of what management is facing, and management understands what the union has to contend with. And so they, before any contract needs to be negotiated or a reduction in force, are having conversations, not just to lay groundwork and say, look, we're about to do layoffs, but to say, hey, here's what I'm staring at and might have to do in 6 months. And so let's think about this together, and obviously they need to trust each other and not leak information. And there have to be certain parameters put in place, I think, around those relationships. But when you said patch, I mean, I guess I would say partly it's the construction of the raft, at first,
Hmm.
and making sure that the important folks are on that boat, on that ship as it's sailing, so that when they hit choppy waters, they're not surprised because they've looked at the map. They've seen some of what lies ahead, and I've seen certain municipalities do that very well when they anticipate huge hits to their budgets and knowing
Hmm.
that they need to do that. But as it relates to the patch, I mean, I don't think there's any substitute, again, for empathy, for understanding that when someone is going to lose their job, they will feel a lot of different things, including fear, not to mention a lack of appreciation, if that's their exit. And so I think that a lot of care needs to be put into the way in which that is communicated, the person doing the communication, the medium or media that's chosen. Too often, especially in large organizations, there's some massive email that goes out, or it looks personal, but it's a form letter. Um, I mean, I get that there is a need for efficiency, but we're talking about real lives and livelihoods, and it's just hard to imagine doing that in a way that will help the organization in the long run if you don't infuse it with real thought and care, both in the words you're choosing, the person delivering them, and the medium. I think all of those things really matter. And then, there's probably some work to do on the back end in terms of not just reassuring the folks left behind about their jobs, but also, sharing as much as you can with them about where that decision came from and what to expect going forward. I think people really benefit from that.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that there's trust, there's empathy, accountability. Those things need to be taken into consideration, such as you mentioned the importance of setting expectations ahead of time. If there was good communication, setting expectations ahead of time, then employees may not feel that breach of trust, that they're getting some sort of they're and they're not surprised when a layoff might occur, and
Right.
then ensuring that there's trust that is built after that event as well.
And there's nothing that's going to build trust more quickly than doing what you say. And so when a workforce is feeling distrustful after a reduction in force, the commitments that the leaders make need to be backed up as quickly as possible by action. When they say we're going to do whatever, I mean, it needs to be very specific and measurable and visible to that workforce, not just in terms of any kind of paycheck adjustment or anything, but whatever kind of care measures they think they're going to take care of. And we're seeing this play out here in Texas, Sam, with the floods. There are numerous calls now for legislative action in the next 2 weeks related to flooding. And
Hmm.
so I think it's important for elected officials to be thinking about that and to be talking about it. I think where the rubber hits the road is what they will do and being able to promise things that they can deliver on. So right now, I think they're promising to bring it up, and I think if I were them, that's where I would leave it. Is we will take this up because it's a large organization. There's 180 plus legislators. You can't necessarily promise something out of them that you can't single-handedly deliver, but say what you're going to do and do it, and that
Right.
builds trust.
Another thing that you kind of briefly touched on was technology,
Mhm.
and one thing that right now is, I mean, technology is going through a new renaissance with the onset of artificial intelligence, and there's some tools out there that can help with communication, help people practice communication. What is your opinion? Does artificial intelligence have a role in the future of conflict management?
I think it does. I was reading, I want to say either a modern love essay or one of those kinds of personal essays where someone was going through a very difficult time and they regularly turned to a AI type tool for support. And I think her point was that it listened without trying to fix anything, and it listened without judgment and so on. And so I mean, just that alone has promise to me because, again, I think so much of the battle we fight on resolving conflict has to do with the way we listen or don't, or how passively we listen, or how self-centeredly we listen. And so, if tools like that can enhance that, and if we expose children in healthy, moderated ways to that experience over and over again, I can see some benefit. I mean, there have already been examples. I can think of one in particular where a company knew that it would have a certain volume of disputes. It's an outward facing company. They do retail consumer kind of business, and the company itself wouldn't always be a responsible party necessarily, meaning I wasn't buying from them, but I was like in their marketplace. And so they created something wherein I can register my sort of grievance and protest, and then the seller could respond. And I think there's some human component to it, but it's meant to be more automated than two people sitting at a table with a third person. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't, and I've certainly heard of colleagues of mine who are, working on generating, bots of various kinds that can be of service. And I guess the only thing I would say to that is that it's important for us to think about what it can do, and not be defensive, at least as a industry. I'm trying to have the attitude that I don't want to sort of say things or take a position about it that sounds like I'm just trying to keep my career intact. I think there are things that I'm well equipped to do and things that I'm poorly equipped to do, and some of them I can maybe acquire through additional training and knowledge acquisition, and some probably not. I can't know all of the different things that have been tried in a similar circumstance at the drop of a hat, and
Mm-hmm.
AI might be able to do that. So I think we have to understand what the values of interpersonal communication are, and understand where AI can't replace that, but AI certainly can help with the rapid acquisition of information and deployment of some, if not best practices, at least commonly used practices that we can share with folks really quickly and easily.
So, is there, as far as leaders considering some of these AI tools, whether they be chatbots or whether they be ways for leaders to practice their communication before they meet with an employee or things like this. What are the particular guardrails that you would recommend at right now, based on in 2025 and what society is ready for?
Well, I guess what occurs to me right off the bat is just the extent to which someone would lean into a bot as a script, for their communication, um, because that's something that I think I've noticed in some of the communications after a disaster, but also just in other meaningful situations. The leaders aren't scripted. I mean, they may have some ideas in mind that they want to convey, some points, but the time for scripting might be a memorial service weeks later or something, not in those moments when people really need you. I think they
Mm.
want to see your humanity. And so if someone were to ask a chatbot, I'm just making up an example, how should I fire this employee, even if they go into real fine grained specifics about the circumstances and it feels very precise in terms of both what they give the tool and what it spits out. uh, Reading from a script, isn't gonna cut it,
Yeah.
and could lead to more pain or difficulty down the road, I think. Um, it's not to say that the tool couldn't provide a framework, which then that supervisor, manager, whoever puts into their own words, or just says in a way that comes through as personal. Um, but I think the risk is that people assume that it can do the thinking for them and the talking for them,
Hmm.
and that's just not, in my mind, that's not what communication is all about, and it's not the way relationships form and thrive and survive. So that some attention has to be paid to that, I think.
A good point. Now, as we wrap up here, is there any final thoughts for leaders, and what is most important for them to get out of this discussion?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when we think about leaders generally, I think we have to consider the interesting ways in which the sort of scope of a person's leadership can cross, and how the leader of a massive multinational corporation can influence the president of the United States, and obviously the president can influence mayors, and the mayors can influence nonprofits, and nonprofits, and advocacy groups can influence them. So I think part of why I love being in communication studies as a discipline is I want to think very carefully about the ways in which a leader's message lands with a variety of different audiences, including those audiences that she or he didn't even think of. There are people in Great Britain listening to the governor of Texas now, and there's headlines in the Philippines about our floods, and the the way in which I can never forget CEO of a large company during the Deepwater Horizon crisis in 2010, talking about his own personal feelings and how those reverberated around the world. So I think you know it's not meant to be an endorsement of cancel culture or of don't say anything because anything you say can and will be used against you. It's more just a signal that we have audiences for our words as leaders that we don't fully understand. And when we choose the things we're going to say and the ways in which we're going to say them, we need to think about those invisible audiences as well as the ones that we are well aware of. What do they need to hear in this moment? What might they be feeling? Um, what will matter to them? What will mean something to them? And frankly, when we don't know what to say that. When an official responding to something horrific and tragic isn't sure how to fix things, how to help the community recover, I think people really appreciate that vulnerability of saying, I know I have a responsibility here to help us heal from this. And right now I'm hurting too. And I don't know how to do that. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to ask a lot of people for advice and figure it out. But I need you to understand that I haven't gotten the answer just yet. So I think a combination of vulnerability and just hyper awareness of all of the different ways that communication will impact folks, frankly, around the world is really key.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schooler, for all this great knowledge you've given our leaders today. So, if they would like to reach out and learn a little bit more about you, what you're doing in the future, and what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, I love LinkedIn. I'd love to see you on LinkedIn as a contact. I co-host a podcast called Resolutions, which is sponsored by the American Bar Association Dispute Resolution section, and would love to hear from you that way or get a suggestion on an episode for us to cover. And you can find me at the University of Texas at Austin, certainly. But LinkedIn's a great place to start, and I'm glad to be on that platform as part of our conversation today, and just appreciate hearing from anybody that's heard our conversation.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for your time, and for those leaders out there that appreciated this conversation. Make sure that you like and leave a comment and subscribe if you're on YouTube. So, love to see you here again. But thank you so much, Dr. Larry Schoolers, for sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it. It's going to make a difference for a lot of those leaders out there listening in.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Sam. Really
All
appreciate
right.
that.
For everyone out there, take care, and we'll see you next.